What happens when a struggling veteran crosses paths with a millionaire who refuses to ignore his plight? This powerful story of resilience and unexpected generosity will leave you questioning the true impact of kindness. Will one chance meeting be enough to transform a life and a community? Watch to find out, and don't forget to share where you're tuning in from, and join us in honoring our heroes. David Langston adjusted his worn-out baseball hat as he entered the small grocery store just down the street from his modest, run-down apartment. He avoided eye contact with the other shoppers, clutching a crumpled grocery list in one hand and a thin envelope of cash in the other. Every dollar had been meticulously counted. He knew this trip wasn't about filling a pantry. It was about getting just enough to make it through the week. The aisles were quiet, save for the soft murmur of shoppers and the occasional beep from the checkout counters. David walked slowly, his eyes scanning the prices as he calculated in his head. A loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a can of soup went into the cart. As he paused by the meat section, he frowned. Even the cheapest pack of chicken thighs was more than he could justify. With a deep breath, he shook his head and moved on. He had served his country for over a decade as a Marine, and yet here he was, debating whether a bag of apples was a luxury he couldn't afford. It wasn't always this way. Years ago, he had a steady job as a mechanic, a loving wife, and a sense of purpose. But after his wife passed and the years of combat injuries caught up to him, life spiraled out of control. The VA benefits helped, but they weren't enough. The job market wasn't kind to a man in his late 50s with chronic back pain and limited formal education. The weight of it all bore down on him as he turned into the checkout line. The line moved quickly, and before he knew it, it was his turn. He placed the items on the conveyor belt, trying to hide his unease as the cashier rang them up. The total appeared on the screen, and David's heart sank. It was a few dollars more than he expected. He reached into his pocket, pulling out every bill and coin he had, but it wasn't enough. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I'll have to put something back." The cashier sighed and tapped impatiently at the register, while the customer behind David rolled their eyes. Hold on," a calm voice interrupted. David turned to see a man in a tailored jacket stepping forward. "I've got it," the man said, placing a credit card on the counter without hesitation. David's eyes widened in disbelief. "You don't have to do that," he stammered. "I want to," the man replied, smiling kindly. "It's the least I can do." David hesitated, unsure whether to feel gratitude or shame. "Thank you," he finally whispered. The man nodded. "No problem. My name's Charles. Let me help you with these." For the first time in a long while, David felt like someone truly saw him. David and Charles exited the grocery store together, the plastic bags in Charles's hand swaying lightly with each step. The crisp sound of the automatic doors sliding shut behind them felt like a wall closing off the tense moment inside. David glanced sideways at the man, still trying to process what had just happened. He was grateful, yes, but also embarrassed. He wasn't used to anyone stepping in to help, let alone someone who looked like Charles. A man whose every detail spoke of success. "You didn't have to do that," David said, his voice low as they reached the parking lot. His hands were stuffed into his jacket pockets, gripping tightly at the fabric as though it might anchor him. "I know," Charles replied easily, his expression calm. "But I wanted to. You looked like you could use a hand." He hesitated for a moment before adding, "We've all been there at some point." David stopped walking, raising an eyebrow at him. "You? Someone like you has been where I am?" He immediately regretted the tone. It sounded defensive, even though it wasn't how he meant it. He was tired, weary from years of feeling invisible, and it slipped out before he could stop himself. Charles didn't seem fazed. He smiled softly and gestured toward a nearby bench. "Why don't we sit for a minute?" David hesitated but nodded, allowing Charles to guide him to the wooden bench under the shade of a small tree. They sat in silence for a moment, David's eyes fixed on the concrete while Charles adjusted the cuffs of his tailored shirt. "I don't know your full story," Charles began, his tone conversational yet genuine, "but I can tell you mine, at least the part that matters here. I wasn't always comfortable, let's say. There was a time I was in debt, my business barely keeping the lights on. I nearly lost everything. I was lucky to have people who helped me out. That's why I try to give back when I can." David listened, unsure of what to say. There was something disarming about Charles, not just his polished exterior but the sincerity in his voice. It felt rare, almost too good to be true. "I guess it's hard to trust that anyone's just trying to be kind," David admitted quietly. Charles nodded, understanding. "I get it. I'm not looking for anything in return, and if you'll let me, I'd like to help you. Not just today. I know some folks who could make a real difference." David looked up, his weathered face softening as hope flickered in his chest. "Why would you go out of your way for someone you don't even know?" Charles shrugged. "Because I believe in people like you. Veterans like you. You've already done so much for this country. Sometimes you just need someone to remind you that you're not forgotten." David swallowed hard, the words settling in a part of him that had been empty for years. "I don't know if I deserve that." Charles placed a hand on his shoulder. "You do. Trust me on that." As the two men rose from the bench, Charles held up one of the grocery bags. "Let me give you a ride home, David. It's the least I can do." David hesitated but nodded. For the first time in years he felt a small but steady glimmer of trust in someone else. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something different. David settled into the passenger seat of Charles' sleek, dark SUV, the leather interior a sharp contrast to the frayed fabric of his own truck's bench seat, which had sat immobile in his apartment complex's lot for months. He shifted awkwardly, unused to such comfort, and instinctively reached for the seatbelt. Charles gave a quick, friendly glance toward him as he started the engine. "Where to, David?" Charles asked, his voice casual as though this were an everyday drive with a friend. David hesitated, feeling a pang of shame. His address wasn't exactly in the kind of neighborhood Charles was likely accustomed to. "It's not far," he finally said, giving the directions in a clipped tone. The car pulled out of the lot and the soft hum of the engine filled the silence. Charles didn't push, allowing David to sit with his thoughts. The passing scenery reflected in the windows, and David found himself gripping the edge of his seat, feeling like a stranger in a world far removed from his own. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Charles finally said, breaking the silence. His tone wasn't probing, just a gentle observation. David glanced at him, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't used to people asking him questions like that, at least not with genuine interest. "You could say that," David replied cautiously. "But I'm not looking for pity, if that's what you're offering." Charles chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I'm not offering pity. I'm offering an ear. Sometimes it helps to talk." David sighed, his gaze fixed on the dashboard. "You wouldn't understand. Civilians rarely do." "Try me," Charles said, his tone steady and unruffled. After a pause, David began speaking, not the whole story, but fragments of it. He spoke of the friends he had lost in combat, the sense of purpose he once had, and how it all seemed to vanish when he returned home. "It's like you come back and everything's different. People look at you like you're broken. Maybe they're not wrong," he said bitterly. Charles listened, nodding slightly. "You're not broken, David. You've been through things most people couldn't imagine. That doesn't mean you can't find a way forward." David didn't answer, but the words settled somewhere deep inside. As they approached his apartment, David's cheeks flushed slightly. The building's faded paint and broken light fixtures were stark reminders of how far he had fallen. "You can just drop me here," David said quickly, hoping to avoid judgment. Charles parked the car and turned off the engine. "Actually, I'd like to help you carry these inside, if that's okay." David blinked, taken aback. "You don't have to do that." "I know," Charles said, stepping out of the car. "But I want to." Together they unloaded the bags, Charles following David up the cracked concrete steps. As they reached David's door, Charles looked around, his expression unreadable. "You've got a lot of fight left in you, David. I can see it. Let's not let this be the end of your story." David stared at him, unsure of what to say. For the first time in a long time, someone was offering more than empty words. They were offering hope. David unlocked the creaky door to his apartment, stepping inside and holding it open for Charles, who followed close behind, carrying the bags. The small room was dimly lit, with only a single lamp casting a warm glow over the faded couch and scratched coffee table. The walls, once white, were now a dull beige, and the faint scent of stale air lingered. Charles set the grocery bags on the kitchen counter, taking a moment to glance around without making it obvious. He wasn't judging, at least not in a way David could sense, but the starkness of the space seemed to strike him. There were no personal touches, no photos, no signs of life beyond the essentials. It was a room that seemed frozen in time, just like David's life had been. "You've got everything you need here?" Charles asked lightly, leaning casually against the counter. David shrugged, pulling the groceries from the bag and placing them in the fridge. "It's enough," he said simply, his tone dismissive. He didn't want to explain how enough was a bare minimum that didn't include things like peace of mind or comfort. Charles nodded thoughtfully. "I get that. Sometimes survival feels like all you can manage." His words hung in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of what wasn't being said. David paused, a carton of milk in his hand. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "Most people wouldn't even look my way, let alone go out of their way like you have." Charles crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly. "Because I can, and because I've seen what happens when people like you slip through the cracks. You've already given so much. It doesn't sit right with me to just stand by." David snorted softly, though there wasn't any malice in it. "You talk like you've got some kind of mission." "Maybe I do," Charles replied with a small smile. "Or maybe I just believe that everyone deserves a hand when they're down, especially those who've earned it." For a moment the room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. David leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. "I'm not used to this. People showing up, helping out. It's not off," Charles said. "It's rare, but it doesn't have to be." David didn't respond immediately. His thoughts swirled as he considered the truth of Charles' words. Finally, he nodded. "Fair enough." Charles checked his watch, shifting his weight. "Listen, I know someone who runs a program for veterans. Helps with job placement, therapy, stuff like that. If you're interested, I can make a call." David stiffened slightly. "I don't know." "No pressure," Charles said quickly. "Just think about it. There's no shame in accepting help. It doesn't make you weak. It means you're smart enough to take the tools you need to get back on your feet." David exhaled deeply, the words cutting through the armor he'd built up over years of disappointment and pride. "I'll think about it," he said at last. "It's all I ask," Charles replied, extending his hand. "For now." David shook it, his grip firm despite the hesitation. As Charles left, David stood by the door, staring after him. The man's words echoed in his mind, sparking something he hadn't felt in a long time, a faint glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The door clicked shut behind Charles, leaving David alone in the quiet of his apartment. He stood there for a moment, staring at the spot where Charles had just been, his thoughts spinning. The man's kindness felt foreign, almost surreal, and it left David uncertain of how to process it. For years, he had carried the weight of survival alone, bracing himself for disappointment at every turn. Now, someone had shown up, offering more than just a polite word or an empty promise. David let out a long sigh and rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the strain of the day settle in. He turned back toward the kitchen, the grocery bags half unpacked on the counter. Pulling out the last few items, he placed them in the fridge and cupboards, his movements slow and deliberate. The act of organizing the food felt like grounding himself, a reminder that this wasn't a dream. As he put away the loaf of bread, his eyes fell on a photo tucked into the corner of the fridge door. It was old and slightly faded, showing him and his wife, Sarah, from years ago. She was laughing, her arm looped around his, while he smiled with a confidence he hadn't felt in a long time. His throat tightened as he stared at it, the memories rushing back uninvited. He hadn't been able to let go of that photo, even though looking at it often felt like reopening a wound. "Sarah," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. "What would you say about all this?" He could almost hear her response, her gentle teasing about how he was too stubborn for his own good. She had always been the optimist, the one who believed in people even when the world seemed dark. David wondered if she would have trusted someone like Charles so easily. Probably, he thought. She always saw the good in people. The sound of a car engine outside pulled him from his thoughts. Moving to the window, he peeked through the blinds, catching sight of Charles's SUV pulling away. Even though the man was gone, something lingered in the air, a sense of possibility that hadn't been there before. David didn't know what to do with it yet, but it was there, waiting for him to decide. He stepped back from the window, sitting down heavily on the worn couch. His fingers tapped absently against the armrest as his mind replayed the conversation with Charles. The idea of reaching out for help, of stepping into something new, was daunting. He had tried before and been met with rejection or bureaucracy that seemed designed to push him further away. But this time it felt different. Charles hadn't just handed him a business card and walked away. He had listened, really listened, and made David feel like his struggles mattered. That was something he hadn't experienced in years. Reaching over, David picked up the phone from the coffee table, his thumb hovering over the screen. He still had Charles's number from when the man insisted they exchange contacts. For a moment, David hesitated, his pride warring with his growing desire for change. Finally, he set the phone down with a sigh. "Not yet," he muttered, "but maybe soon." The decision wasn't made yet, but for the first time in a long while, David felt like it could be. He leaned back on the couch, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Change was terrifying, but maybe, just maybe, it was possible, and that small spark of hope was enough to get him through the night. It had been 3 days since Charles's visit, and David found himself sitting on the edge of his bed, phone in hand. The screen glowed faintly in the dim room, Charles' number displayed prominently. He hadn't called yet, but he had thought about it more times than he could count. The paper Charles left with information about the Veterans Program lay unfolded on the small nightstand, its neat lettering staring back at him like a challenge. David exhaled deeply, setting the phone down once again. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and rubbed his face with his hands. "What am I doing?" he muttered to himself. The weight of indecision pressed heavily on him. A part of him wanted to take the step, to believe that someone like Charles genuinely wanted to help, but another part, the louder, more cynical part, warned him against hoping too much. But the shrill ring of the phone suddenly broke the silence, startling him. He picked it up hesitantly, frowning at the unknown number on the screen. "Hello?" he answered, his voice cautious. "David, this is Charles," the voice on the other end said warmly. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." David blinked in surprise. "No, it's fine. What's up?" "I just wanted to check in," Charles replied. "I know I left you with a lot to think about. I also wanted to tell you I spoke to my friend who runs that veterans program I mentioned. They're expecting your call, but there's no rush. I just thought you should know." David was silent for a moment, digesting the information. He wasn't used to this someone following up, making sure he was okay without an ulterior motive. "Thanks," he said finally. "I appreciate that." "No problem," Charles said, his tone light but genuine. "How are you holding up?" David hesitated, unsure how much to share. "I'm managing," he said vaguely. "Well," Charles continued, "if you're open to it, I was thinking maybe we could grab a coffee sometime. No pressure, just a chance to talk." David hesitated again, the offer catching him off guard. "You don't give up, do you?" Charles chuckled. "Not when I see potential. So, what do you say?" After a long pause, David nodded, though Charles couldn't see it. "Okay. Coffee sounds good." "Great," Charles said. "I'll text you the details. See you soon, David." The call ended, and David sat there for a while, staring at the phone in his hand. A small part of him felt lighter, as if a door he had thought was locked had cracked open just a little. He still didn't know what to expect, but, for the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't entirely alone. The coffee meeting came sooner than he expected. They met at a small cafe near downtown, a quiet spot with mismatched chairs and the faint aroma of freshly baked pastries. Charles was already there when David arrived, waving him over to a corner table. "David," Charles greeted him with a firm handshake and a warm smile. "Glad you could make it." David slid into the seat across from him, feeling slightly out of place, but also curious. "You're persistent, I'll give you that," he said with a half-smile. "It's a strength and a flaw," Charles admitted, laughing lightly, "but I think it might come in handy here." As they began to talk, David found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected. Charles wasn't pushy. He listened more than he spoke, letting David share at his own pace. By the end of their conversation, David felt like a small weight had been lifted off his shoulders. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and for now, that was enough. David arrived home after his coffee meeting with Charles, still turning over the conversation in his mind. The man was certainly persistent, but there was something undeniably genuine about him. Charles didn't come across as someone who pitied him or acted out of guilt. He seemed driven by a sincere desire to help. That realization unsettled David. He wasn't used to being cared about in that way, and it made him wonder how much of himself he'd lost over the years. The paper Charles had left him with the Veterans Program information was still sitting on the table. David picked it up, running his fingers over the printed words. It felt like an invitation, a lifeline he wasn't sure he was ready to grab. His pride whispered to him, urging him to manage on his own like he always had. But the other part of him, the tired, worn-down part, wanted to believe that maybe accepting help didn't mean he'd failed. With a deep breath, David picked up his phone and dialed the number listed on the sheet. It rang twice before a cheerful voice answered on the other end. "Veterans Outreach Alliance, this is Tammy. How can I help you?" David hesitated, suddenly unsure of what to say. "Hi, my name's David Langston. I was referred by a friend. He said you might be able to help me out." "Of course, David," Tammy said, her tone bright and encouraging. "We'd be happy to assist. Can I get a bit more information about what you're looking for? Housing, employment, counseling?" "Honestly," David began, his voice faltering slightly, "I don't even know. Things have been rough. I guess I'm just trying to figure out where to start." "Well, you've taken the first step, and that's a big deal," Tammy assured him. "How about we schedule a meeting with one of our coordinators? They can walk you through everything we offer and help you create a plan that works for you." "Yeah," David said, nodding, even though she couldn't see him. "That sounds good." "Great. We'll set you up for later this week. And don't worry, we're here to make the process as easy as possible." After hanging up, David sat back and exhaled slowly. The call had been nerve-wracking, but he felt a sense of relief. Like a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. For the first time in years, there was a sliver of a plan forming in his life, a direction he could move toward. The next day, Charles called to check in. When David mentioned he had contacted the outreach program, Charles' enthusiasm was palpable even through the phone. "That's amazing, David," Charles said. "You've already done the hardest part, taking that first step. Let me know if there's anything else you need, okay?" David chuckled softly. "I'm starting to think you're not going to let me quit even if I wanted to." "You'd be right about that," Charles replied. "You've got too much fight left in you to give up now." The words stayed with David long after the call ended. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't navigating his struggles entirely alone. It wasn't just Charles or Tammy or the outreach program. It was the idea that maybe, just maybe, there were people who cared enough to stick around. And as scary as it was to hope, David was beginning to think it might be worth it. David arrived at the Veterans Outreach Alliance's office early, his nerves thrumming with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. The small brick building was modest but inviting, with a neatly painted sign out front and an American flag fluttering in the breeze. David parked his truck, recently jump-started with help from a neighbor, and took a moment to collect himself before stepping out. This was new territory for him, and he wasn't entirely sure he belonged here. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming. The receptionist, Tammy, greeted him with a cheerful smile. "David Langston, right? You're right on time. I'll let Ryan know you're here." David nodded, giving her a polite smile. As he waited, he scanned the room. The walls were lined with photographs of veterans, some in uniform, others at community events, and motivational quotes about resilience and service. It was a reminder that he wasn't the only one struggling, and that others had found a way forward. "David," a voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to see a man in his early 40s with a firm handshake and a kind expression. "I'm Ryan. Thanks for coming in. Let's head to my office." The two men sat down in a small, cluttered office with a window that let in the afternoon sunlight. Ryan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "So, tell me a bit about yourself, David. What brings you here?" David hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him. "I don't even know where to start," he admitted, his voice low. "It's been a rough few years. Lost my wife, couldn't keep up with work. Things just fell apart." Brian nodded, his expression empathetic. "That's more common than you think, David. And it's nothing to be ashamed of. The fact that you're here today says a lot about your strength." David looked down, his hands clasped tightly. "I'm not sure how much strength I've got left." "Well," Ryan said with a gentle smile, "that's what we're here for. You don't have to do this alone." For the next hour, they talked. Ryan asked questions about David's background, his time in the Marines, and what he hoped to achieve moving forward. David was honest, admitting he wasn't sure what he wanted, but that he was tired of feeling stuck. Ryan listened carefully, offering reassurances and ideas without pushing too hard. By the end of the meeting, David had a tentative plan. Ryan had set him up with resources for counseling and a part-time job opportunity at a local auto shop that worked with veterans. "It's just a start," Ryan said, handing him a folder with all the details. "But sometimes a small step is all it takes to get the momentum going." David left the office feeling lighter than he had in years. The sense of hopelessness that had weighed him down for so long had been replaced by something else, a faint but steady spark of determination. He wasn't entirely sure what the future held, but for the first time, he believed it might hold something worth working toward. As he climbed into his truck, he found himself smiling, a quiet but genuine expression of hope. David stepped into the local auto shop a few days later, his nerves bubbling just beneath the surface. He had spent most of his adult life avoiding handouts, but this job felt different. It wasn't charity, it was a chance to do something he was good at, something he hadn't done in years. The smell of motor oil and rubber greeted him as he walked past rows of cars in various stages. It was a smell he associated with better times, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of familiarity. "David Langstone?" a gruff voice called from the back. A man in his late 50s with grease-stained hands and a ball cap stepped forward, wiping his hands on a rag. "I'm Frank. Ryan told me to expect you." David extended his hand, his grip firm. "Nice to meet you, Frank. Thanks for giving me a shot." Frank nodded, his expression unreadable but not unkind. "You come with a good recommendation. That means something around here. Let's see what you've got." Frank wasted no time putting David to work, handing him a pair of overalls and assigning him to a simple oil change. David rolled up his sleeves, eager to prove himself. As he worked, the repetitive motions of the job brought a sense of calm he hadn't felt in years. The sounds of the shop, tools clanging, the low hum of conversation, and the occasional burst of laughter made him feel like he was part of something again. By the end of the day, David had worked on 3 cars and even lent a hand to a younger mechanic who was struggling with a tricky repair. "Not bad for your first day," Frank said as they locked up the shop. "You've got a steady hand. I can see you've done this before." David nodded, a hint of pride creeping into his voice. "It's been a while, but yeah, I used to be a mechanic before things changed." Frank clapped him on the shoulder. "You've still got it. Keep showing up like this and you'll fit in just fine." As David walked to his truck, he couldn't help but smile. The day had been physically demanding, but in a good way. He felt useful again, like he was contributing to something bigger than himself. The sense of purpose he had longed for was beginning to return, piece by piece. Later that evening, David called Charles to update him on how things were going. "It's just a start," David admitted, "but it feels good, better than I expected." Charles' voice was warm on the other end of the line. "That's great to hear, David. You've taken some big steps. I'm proud of you." Thanks, David said, his voice quieter now. I didn't think I'd get here, to be honest, but it's starting to feel like maybe I can move forward. You can, Charles replied firmly, and you're not alone in this. Remember that. As the call ended, David sat back in his chair, a cup of coffee in hand. He glanced at the folder from the outreach program still sitting on the table, now filled with notes and plans. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving, he was rebuilding. And for the first time, he truly believed he could. The community center buzzed with energy as veterans and their families gathered for the outreach program's monthly event. It was David's first time attending something like this, and he couldn't help but feel a mix of nerves and curiosity. Rows of tables displayed resources, job listings, mental health services, housing assistance, while volunteers moved through the crowd with welcoming smiles. It was a world David had kept himself separate from for years, but now he was ready to see what it had to offer. Charles stood by the door when David walked in, waving him over with an encouraging smile. "Glad you made it," he said, clapping David on the back. "How's the job treating you?" "Good," David replied, a genuine smile breaking across his face. "Better than good, actually. I forgot how much I liked getting my hands dirty." "I knew you'd fit right in," Charles said. "Today's about more than work, though. There's a lot here that could help you keep building momentum." David nodded, taking in the room. He spotted Ryan in the corner, chatting with a group of veterans, and made his way over. As they exchanged greetings, Ryan gestured to the crowd. "This is what it's all about," he said. "Community. You've got people here who know exactly what you've been through and want to help you move forward." David listened, his gaze drifting to the stage at the front of the room where a microphone stood waiting. "What's that for?" he asked, nodding toward it. "Alan," Ryan said with a grin. "That's for anyone who wants to share their story. It's a chance to inspire others, to show them that it's possible to get through the tough times." David froze at the thought. Speak in front of a crowd, share his story? He wasn't sure he could do that. But as the event unfolded, he watched other veterans step up to the mic. They spoke about their struggles, their triumphs, and the people who had helped them along the way. The room filled with applause after each story, a tangible sense of solidarity growing with every. Toward the end of the event, Charles nudged David. "You should go up there." David shook his head, laughing nervously. "No way, that's not my thing." "Maybe it should be," Charles said gently. "You've come a long way, David. People need to hear that." After a long pause, David nodded. "All right, I'll give it a shot." He walked up to the stage, his heart pounding, and took the microphone. The room fell silent as he looked out at the faces before him. "I'm not great at this kind of thing," he began, his voice shaky, "but I wanted to say thank you to all of you." He took a deep breath and continued, sharing a condensed version of his journey, his struggles, his hesitations, and the people like Charles and Ryan who had helped him take the first steps toward rebuilding his life. "It's not easy," he said, his voice growing steadier, "but it's worth it. And if I can start over, so can you." The room erupted into applause as David stepped back from the mic, his chest swelling with a sense of pride and belonging he hadn't felt in years. Charles met him at the bottom of the stage, grinning. "Told you." David laughed, shaking his head. Yeah, you were right." As the event wound down, David left the center with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was thriving. And for the first time in a long time, he believed the best was yet to come.